Well, today we continue talking about events at sea during the American Civil War, and in particular about the clash between ironclads that took place at Hampton Roads on March 9, 1862. A historic event because it was the first battle between armored ships. So we need to take a few steps back. We saw that the Southerners, since the summer of 1861, they began modifying the naval frigate Merrimac in the city of Norfolk, which had been preserved and saved from the destructive Norfolk fire by carefully cutting down its original hull and constructing a sort of armored casemate structure on top. Over this, they built a sloped roof above the hull, and the entire structure was then reinforced and armored with strong iron bars in order to make this ironclad ship practically invincible, almost completely invulnerable to enemy cannon fire. However, there were major problems, as I was saying. The engines were salvaged from the same Merrimac, but they had significant issues. This ship moved very slowly, and moreover, at first, after careful evaluation, it was determined that the thickness of the armor was not thick enough to provide adequate protection. Tests had been conducted, so the Tredegar Iron Works in Richmond added 2 layers of iron plates to provide a thickness of at least 10 centimeters. To these sturdy, solid iron bars that intersected and crossed each other at right angles, forming a strong grid. And then beneath them, there was also an additional layer of dense, heavy oak wood, which was about 16 centimeters thick, providing extra support and reinforcement. A large smokestack stood above this casemate, which, as I recall, really looked like a roof. It had walls sloped at 35 degrees specifically to deflect cannonballs and make it less vulnerable to artillery fire. Above the casemate was the pilot house, which was also covered and protected with armor plating. The hull was also armored, but not entirely. Only the part that protruded above the water and a few centimeters just below the waterline were made of metal. Below this, the ship was constructed from wood, making it potentially vulnerable in that area. The rudder and the propeller were also considered vulnerable as they were not well protected. Another thing to remember about this ship was its armament. The armament consisted of as many as 10 cannons, 4 Brooke rifled guns, and 6 smoothbore Dahlgren guns. The 2 main Brooke cannons were positioned at the stern and bow, and each had 3 different gun ports, so they could be aimed in various directions. The Virginia could potentially fire either solid, let's say, spherical projectiles, or the famous shells that Brooke was experimenting with at the time, armor-piercing projectiles. It could also fire heated, red-hot shot, which was possible because 2 of these powerful cannons had a small furnace located nearby for that very purpose. And of course, it could also fire explosive shells, making it a truly versatile weapon on the battlefield. Explosive shells like the Pixan type or even ogival projectiles, which were also equipped with explosive charges in addition to the regular canister shot that might be fired at close range, perhaps during boarding actions. Another important weapon that this ironclad known as the Virginia possessed was the ram. This ram was specifically installed at the bow precisely because, according to Mallory, the future of naval battles, thanks to the increasing use of steam engines, also lay in utilizing these rams, since ships could maneuver more freely. It was, in essence, like a kind of bayonet for ships. But as I mentioned earlier, there were major difficulties in building this ship, and there were also significant challenges in recruiting the crew. The crew numbered over 300 people. And above all, the most problematic issue arose precisely in February 1862, when the ship was almost ready to set sail. Was that essentially part of the hull was sticking out too much above the water. Why? Because the designer, John Porter, who together with Brooke had originally conceived of and carefully designed this ship, had unfortunately made a miscalculation. In calculating the total weight of the Virginia and thus determining how much water it would draw, he failed to subtract the weight of the masts, the sails, and the rigging that the Merrimack previously had, and which, of course, the Virginia no longer had because it was powered exclusively by these geared engines. They tried to compensate for these issues by loading the ship with scrap metal, several hundred kilos of scrap, but the ship still wouldn't sit much lower in the water, and from the turret they couldn't load any more. Otherwise, the ship's ability to move would have been reduced to zero. And this was certainly a major concern for the captain, the commander of the Virginia, Captain Franklin Buchanan. He was a seasoned and experienced sea dog, as the saying goes. Just think about it. He was actually there with Admiral Perry, the renowned American naval officer, when he first arrived in Japan, when he landed on the shores of Japan. Buchanan was a citizen of the state of Maryland, and when the southern states began to secede from the Union, anticipating that Maryland, which, I remind you, was a slave state at the time, would also secede, he made the decision to resign from the United States Navy. However, Maryland was forcibly kept in the Union precisely because the District of Columbia, the capital district of Washington, was located in that state. So Buchanan tried to return to the Union Navy, but he was rejected, and therefore, whether he liked it or not, he ended up offering his services. At first, he was placed in charge of one of the departments of the Confederate Navy Ministry, and then he was assigned to command the ships that were responsible for protecting the James River, which was the river leading to Richmond. Alongside him, there were other officers. His second in command was Catesby A.P. Jones, A.P. is a Welsh patronymic. This Jones then was a first lieutenant, which is equivalent to our corvette captain. He had practically spent almost his entire career as an officer in charge of artillery. He had worked with Dahlgren, the admiral who had remained with the Union and who had designed all these cannons. He would prove to be a truly excellent officer, later directing an important foundry, Selma, specifically for the Navy in Alabama. But there were also other important officers, like Taylor Wood, who was the nephew of General Taylor, the hero of the war against Mexico and later President of the United States. Then there were Robert Minor and Hunter Davidson. Hunter Davidson was extremely important because he later went on to head the Confederate Underwater Mine Office. So we see a group of officers truly of excellent quality, with experience and great ingenuity. Then, to summarize briefly and in short, it was stated and reported that there were a total of 300 men who were employed and assigned as crew members on board the ship. Not all of these individuals were experienced sailors, because some of the men who made up the crew had actually been recruited and brought in from the land troops, that is, from the army, rather than from the navy. However, overall, it was considered to be a good and capable crew, and therefore, with the aim and intention of driving away Thank you very much. The Union ships enforcing the blockade at the beginning of March, Buchanan finally decided to take action. In short, the structure was finished, the Virginia, and so it set in motion. Initially, Buchanan wanted to strike at the Union battery stationed at Newport, near Fort Monroe, right at the mouth of the James River. However, to do this, he first had to drive off the Union ships and then secure support on land from General Magruder's troops, who at that time, he was in command of the Confederate troops on the Virginia Peninsula. However, Magruder ultimately withdrew. He simply didn't want to cooperate with this operation, but Buchanan decided to attack anyway. The 5 ships that made up the James River blockade force, which were in Chesapeake Bay between Norfolk and Fort Monroe, which was the Union stronghold on the Virginia Peninsula. I should remind you that at that time, there was a major risk that the Union Army of the Potomac, commanded by General George McClellan, would land right on the Virginia Peninsula or even go up the James River and land troops just a few kilometers from Richmond. In fact, even at the very beginning of the war, the old General Winfield Scott had developed this plan called the Anaconda Plan to strangle the South by blockading its ports and cutting off access to the Mississippi and the Gulf of Mexico. Yes, it was a good strategy, but it was a passive one. In other words, it didn't involve incursions into Southern territory. Instead, Washington wanted there to also be a land army that would quickly resolve the matter. So McClellan drew inspiration from both strategies and decided to transport his men by ship. This created an imminent danger. Virginia had to intervene as soon as possible to drive away, as I mentioned earlier, the enemy ships, but also to remove the threat of a large army landing right near the Confederate capital. So Buchanan, finally escorted by two smaller ships of the Southern Navy, namely the Rayleigh and the Buford, were responsible for towing during the initial stretch of the journey. Since the departure point was Norfolk, there was a section that needed to be covered along the Elizabeth River. After navigating this river section, the convoy finally reached the open sea at Hampton Roads, located in the Chesapeake Bay. Incidentally, Buchanan had also requested the help of three other ships under the command of Captain Tucker: the Patrick Henry, an adapted gunboat with 10 cannons, which would later become a training ship for Confederate Navy cadets, and two smaller gunboats, each with 1 or 2 cannons. In short, this small flotilla set out toward the ships. The Union ships present at that particular moment included 2 frigates, namely the Congress and the Cumberland, both of which were sailing frigates, so let's say of the older type. Gradually, however, as soon as the Confederate ships appeared, 3 additional ships arrived, one of which was the Minnesota, the twin sister of the old Merrimac, the ship that had made it possible to create the Virginia. The Virginia itself, however, proved to be a very effective ship. It moved slowly and looked like a big coffee pot on the water, but even though the Union ships, especially the Cumberland, started to bombard it, the shells just bounced off its armor. Its armor held, and as it moved to ram the Cumberland, it also began to return fire, bombarding the Congress. Meanwhile, the Minnesota, which was coming to defend the other 2 ships, ran aground and could no longer move. The other 2 ships also ran aground before they could even get close to the site of the battle. So the Virginia, with its ram, managed to open a huge breach in the Cumberland. Witnesses said a cart could pass through it, and we see that. This ship began to sink rapidly, tilting at a 45-degree angle and going down into the sea. The Virginia suffered damage to its ram. In fact, its ram was broken. And pay attention, because this will be very important the next day. Despite everything, she pulled away from the Cumberland and began heading toward the Congress in order to bombard her. The crew of the Congress also realized there was nothing they could do. Even returning fire was essentially futile at this point, so they tried with the help of a boat, the Zouave, to tow her ashore, attempting to run her aground. They would run aground, but at least that would prevent them from being destroyed by the Virginia, which, due to her draft, required several meters of depth and couldn't go into shallower waters. However, the Virginia got there first and began delivering very precise shots to the hull of the Congress, which soon caught fire. At that point, the captain of the ship had no choice but to request surrender. At this point, something very important and significant happened. The other Confederate gunboats began to approach the Congress to take the prisoners. So some men even left the Virginia to assist with the operation. In particular, Officer Minor was tasked with taking these prisoners. But let's remember that this battle took place in a bay where the shores were quite nearby, very close, in fact almost within earshot. There were even spectators, curious onlookers, who had gathered to witness this epic clash, all because there had been a great deal of publicity from the Confederate authorities about the deployment of this powerful ironclad warship. So, as a result, Union sharpshooters were positioned on the shore, carefully aiming and firing at the Confederate sailors, hoping to disrupt their actions during the ongoing battle. And in fact, Minor was wounded. At this point, Buchanan also came out of the Virginia to see what was happening, and he too was seriously wounded in the femoral artery, losing a lot of blood. And this was a decisive episode because Buchanan would not be present the next day. In any case, the soldiers of the Virginia would return to their boats The prisoners would be transported to safety from the Congress, and at this point, the Virginia should have gone on to destroy the Minnesota as well, which was immobile, stranded, and defenseless. However, by then it was already late, well into the afternoon, and in any case, the Virginia had also sustained some damage. Its ram had broken, its smokestack had problems, and even the ventilation system had issues, I recall. Thank you. Even under normal conditions, the inside of the Virginia was a real hell. There was smoke, unbearable heat, cramped spaces, so it was also appropriate to give the sailors a bit of a break. Besides, the Minnesota wasn't going anywhere. It was stranded and would still be there the next day. So the Virginia went to anchor at Sewell Point, where it remained for the entire night. But during the night, something important happened. In fact, as I mentioned earlier, the Southern newspapers had heavily publicized the construction of the Virginia, even in the preceding months. The Virginia had been under construction since the summer of 1861. It took a long time, and word of the ship's construction had even reached the north. Some people didn't take it very seriously, but Vasa Fox, on the other hand, understood that it could indeed be a threat. I should remind you that before the war, the United States didn't have any ironclad ships. So Washington decided to entrust a commission of 3 officers, including Pauling, with the task the old commander who had evacuated the Norfolk Arsenal to evaluate designs for building ironclad ships. You never know, after all. And it was precisely in September-October of 1861 that 3 designs were approved. The first for a ship called New Ironside and another called Galena, which were basically 2 ships that somewhat reflected the style of the French ship Gloire and the British Warrior, regular ships with hulls protected by armor plating. In this respect, they weren't a great innovation. The Virginia was already different because there were no sails. It was a completely new structure, stripped down to the essentials, with just this crazy house from which the cannons were fired. So these 2 projects, the Galena and the New Ironside, were both officially approved, but as is often the case with major undertakings, it would inevitably take some time. And a great inventor of Swedish origin was called upon to contribute, namely a certain John Ericsson, who, just imagine, had already designed a locomotive. He was beaten to the punch by Stephenson, but interestingly, it seems that Ericsson's locomotive was actually superior, even though Stephenson ultimately secured the patent. And then, after some time, he moved to the United States. Remember, as we have already discussed, we talked about Ericsson, who was the brilliant inventor of the screw propeller and who actually built the ship called the Princeton for an American ship owner, a certain Mr. Stoughton. He constructed this vessel, the Princeton, which was a ship with a metal hull, a rather advanced design for that era. Before the war began, he presented this ship to the authorities, offering it as a demonstration of his engineering prowess and the potential of new shipbuilding techniques, among whom were the foreign minister, the Secretary of State at the time, and the Secretary of the Navy. Well, just think that, as luck would have it, on this ship, the Princeton, there was a cannon, a very large cannon, but it was a prototype, a large caliber cannon that Ericsson had designed but had not yet tested. He wanted to put it on the ship and use it anyway. I think it was called the pacemaker, something like that, the peacemaker, something along those lines. In short, an accident happened when this cannon was fired, a shot exploded and killed the 2 US ministers, injuring other people as well. It was a major tragedy for Ericsson, who, despite the merit of his inventions, was accused of being responsible for this incident, and so he was sidelined for about a dozen years. But this time, the Washington government needed him again, and he was consulted to give his opinion on these 2 ironclads. Ericsson not only gave his opinion on the 2 ironclads, he did even more. He presented Navy Secretary Wells with an innovative design for a new ironclad, the Monitor, which was completely different from the others and also totally different from the Virginia because it was basically a flat surface, fully armored with a very shallow draft, powered by 2 steam engines with horizontal pistons that took up less vertical space and could therefore be placed below the waterline, and the only thing protruding above the water was a rotating turret with 2 cannons. So you can understand that this was something innovative, a fully armored rotating turret, which also reduced the chance of being hit because the ship's surface area was really small. Just think, to operate the Monitor, only about 60 crew members were needed, including officers, whereas the Virginia required 320, just to give you a comparison. And in the end, the Monitor project was also accepted. Initially, there was a lot of skepticism. What had happened to Ericsson years earlier played a role, but also this strange ship, some people said it would never float, yet it was built in record time. In just over 100 days, the Monitor was ready, because its various components were built in different shipyards and then assembled once completed. What was the armament of the Monitor? Well, the Monitor had these two cannons on the rotating turret. They were two Dahlgren cannons with a caliber of almost 30 centimeters, gigantic smoothbore cannons that fired solid round shot and the famous explosive shells. So this prototype of the Monitor was well built and quickly assembled in New York. At the beginning of March, it was ordered to move to sail along the coast to reach Hampton Roads, because it was known that the Virginia would intervene there, this ironclad that the Confederates were building. While the Union's knowledge of the ironclad Virginia was well known, it is less clear whether the Confederates actually knew that the Union was also building an ironclad. It seems, however, that something had been suspected or imagined. With all the shipyards the Union had, they were certainly capable of building an ironclad. Therefore, there was also a certain urgency on the part of the Confederates to immediately bring the Virginia into action to break through the defenses, destroy the enemy ships, and regain control of Chesapeake Bay. However, the Monitor had significant difficulty reaching Norfolk at Hampton Roads because it actually sailed quite poorly, handled the ocean badly, and nearly capsized at least 3 times. Indeed, the engine stalled. It was, in short, a truly difficult voyage. But finally, on the evening of March 8th, it managed to reach the Minnesota. While the Congress was exploding because it had been reached by the flames, they had reached the powder magazine, so, with an immense roar, an enormous fire, it signaled to the newly arrived crew of the Monitor what had happened that day. The Monitor drew alongside the Minnesota. The commander of the Monitor was Lieutenant John Worden, and he received orders from Admiral Goldsborough, who was the one who was the commander of that fleet, of that part of the Union's Atlantic forces, to protect the Minnesota for the following day. What else can be said about the specific features of the Monitor? Well, I want to point out that the most vulnerable spot was the pilot house. The pilot house was on the deck and actually protruded from the deck. It was a small square box. But it wasn't adequately protected from enemy fire. And above all, it effectively prevented the cannons from firing in that direction, because actually there was the turret above the deck and then this little cabin for the commander and the pilot. So the rotating turret had to be careful not to hit its own crew with a direct shot. I should mention that the rotating turret was supported by ball bearings and was operated by steam from the engines, taking about 30 seconds to complete a 360-degree rotation. So this rotating turret was a major innovation. Just think, by using the power of steam, the 2 cannons that fired could be adjusted. There was a sort of rail that, when a valve was activated, allowed, thank you, the cannons to be pulled back, which made it possible to load them and then to return them to their aiming position. This was completely different from the Virginia, where the cannons were mounted on carriages, let's say in the Marseille style, that is, these wooden carts with wheels tied with rope. When the shot was fired, naturally, the cannon would recoil along with its carriage, with its frame. It would roll back, be reloaded, and then again, using the ropes, it would be pulled back up to the gun port and fired again. The Monitor was an extremely modern ship, and the next day, around 7 in the morning, when the Virginia started moving again, Buchanan and even Minor were no longer there, as they had been wounded. It was now commanded by Cosby Jones. It headed straight for the Minnesota to finish its job and destroy it with cannon fire, when suddenly this Monitor appeared, which looked almost like a cheese box on a tray, and then a cannon duel began between the 2 ironclads. But soon it ended in a stalemate, in the sense that neither was able to successfully penetrate the other's strong armor. If the day before the Virginia had prevailed over the regular wooden ships, now it had a worthy opponent. So, what did Jones try to do? He then tried to use the ram, which I recall had been damaged, almost completely broken, but there was still a piece attached to the bow of the Virginia. So he tried to get close to the Monitor to ram her, but the Monitor, with great skill and being a bit faster than the Virginia, managed to pull away and at that moment was also able to fire a few cannon shots at close range. After that, the Monitor pulled away a bit and the Virginia tried to maneuver but at a certain point became stuck. And getting stuck meant that she risked being stranded.